Yeah. Okay. Beginning top of Kuf Amud Aleph, Mishnah. This continues a discussion that we had before about the different ways to divide things. So you have a question about what to do because there's a doubt, and obviously in the set of Isser, whether a chicken is, whether an egg is kosher or whether a pot is kosher, there's one set of laws. When it comes to monetary matters between two people, so first of all, you'll always have a loser, which is not fun, right? You don't really have much of a loser in case of chicken egg, or a pot. In most cases, you can kasher the pot or something like that. But over here, you always have a winner and a loser. What do you do about it? So here's we got to get to another scenario. A guy exchanges an ox for a donkey. Kuf Amud Aleph, 100a, top of the page.
Oh, the Mishnah.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Mishnah. Okay, so guy exchanges I'm sorry, not an ox, a cow with a donkey. The Yolda, and the cow gave birth. Now, the critical feature here is very important to understand. Why is it not a sale? Very simple, because if it was a sale, if you buy what happened here is we don't know if the cow gave birth after transaction occurred or before the transaction occurred. Now, if you purchase the cow, you would know the answer. You know why? Because in order to purchase a cow, you must do mashicha. You pull in the mashicha. If you do mashicha, well, then you know if the animal gave birth or not. So it can be referring to a sale. What it's referring to is chalipin. So the kinyan was done on the donkey. Nobody knows what happened. Nobody knows what happened to the cow in the interim. Had it already given birth, or was it still pregnant? The same thing if a guy sold his slave. Selling a slave does not require mashiach because a slave is like property. So therefore, kesef works, money works. So he sold a maidservant, and she gave birth, and we have a debate here. The first guy says ad shalei macharti, the birth happened before I sold it. The zemer, and the other guy says mishalakachti, it happened after I bought it. So what do? They split it. They had two slaves. One was a big slave, one was a small slave. The chaim beis sadis or two fields. Achas gedela, achas ketana, one large, one small. The buyer says, "I bought the large one." Obviously, right? He wants the big one, and the seller says, "I don't know." The buyer gets the large one. The seller is confident, and he says, "Cotton macharti, I sold you the small one." And the buyer says, I don't know. He only has the small fields. Yeah. Clearly. 1 second. They both fighting with each other. One guy's confident that it was the big slave, the buyer, and the seller is confident it was a small slave. Then the seller makes an oath that he sold the small slave, and he gives him the small slave. Now, this appears to be a type of bavametzia. The problem is that it isn't a bavametzia. In other words, it seems like there's a large slave, and you admit at least a small slave. Mm-hmm. The problem is there's a number of reasons why this is not bavametzia. There are 3 separate reasons. We'll get to it in the Gemara. Bavametzia is where a guy, you owe me 50, the guy says, no, you owe me 100, the guy says, no, I paid you back 50 already. So over here they're fighting over slaves. Right. So the last scenario, the buyer says big slave, the seller says small slave. So it's like a bavametzia. And we'll see why it's not a bavametzia, but the proposal by bavametzia is your kol hashbon shemetar hashbon v'lo mishalman. You have to make an oath and not pay. So the seller makes an oath and doesn't pay. He only gives him what he admits to, which is a small slave. Zemer and Idea, they both don't know. Yachloiku, they split. Okay. Okay, the first scenario of the Mishnah was they were debating over when the animal gave birth. So the Gemara says, why are they splitting? Why are they splitting the value of the feed of the infant, the baby cow? The calf, they should split it. I'm sorry, why are they splitting it? Let's see who has the animal. In other words, whoever has the animal in his possession, he's what we call the muhsik. The other guy is trying to take it away from him. He has to bring the proof. So the Gemara says, it's standing in a swamp, meaning it's standing in an ownerless field. So there's no muhsik here. Nobody has first rights over it. So Gemara says, Shivchanami the kind of symptom. The maidservant also, she's in a public area, like a sort of a side street that was dedicated for business. Gemara says, "V'nukma achazaka." Achazaka the marakama. Let's use the rule of marakama to establish. And the other guy should be considered the taker. Let's explain. What's a marakama? Marakama is the idea that if we know something to be the case, then we presume that thing is exactly the same until the last moment where we're forced to say it changed. For example, you own a car, right? And I don't know, maybe the car is yours, maybe it's not yours, right? But the chazaka of the Marakama says, because you're the first known owner, so I presume the car is yours until I'm forced to say otherwise, right? For example, if I see a title that has somebody else's name in it, and it's dated recently, then I must conclude that at that point, and no later, and no earlier, was the car sold. Similarly, over here, the seller, the guy who originally owned the cow, let's say that the cow belongs to him up until the moment where we can't say it belongs to him anymore. But if that's the case, then we can presume the animal belongs to the guy who had it originally, the calf, because we presume that the animal was always his until the last moment where we were forced to say otherwise, and therefore we can say that the birth of the calf happened in his domain. The Gemara says, this is the opinion of Sumchus. Sumchus says, without an oath. Sumchus is of the opinion that when you have a doubt about money, you split the money. Now, generally speaking, we'll pause here. Let's continue, and we'll get back to this in a moment. The Gemara asks, until now, Sumchus was Sumchus was said when both people are uncertain. But Bari Miyamar, did he say it by Bari? Okay, so the first opinion is Amar Barafona in Amar Sumchus feel Bari. So Rabbi Barafona says, yeah, he did. Okay, so let's explain. According to Sumchus, both Bari Ubari or Shema v'Shema, meaning if the claims are certain or they're uncertain, Sumchus says the resolution to every problem is you split the baby. Right, so you have a baby calf, you sell him, and you split the baby, and you're good. Now, clearly the Sumchus holds that the preferred resolution for debate violates the law of Marakama. To be more accurate, Marakama is not a law, it's a presumption. So that's fine. The opinion of Sumchus is that the presumption that the preference for splitting the baby is more important than the presumption of the Marakama. So the Gemara had a question: what happened to Marakama? And the answer is it's overridden by Sumchus's preferred method of resolution. Now, one second. Okay. Now the Gemara asks, what happened? Is Sumchus only by uncertain claims or just by certain claims? And the Gemara, according to Rabbi Rafuna, the answer is yeah, it's by both. Whether a claim is certain or uncertain, the preferred method of Sumchus is yachlaiku. However, there's another opinion. Rava says, Sumchus, the truth of the matter is this is not a valid response because Sumchus only made his statement by uncertain claims. In the first scenario of the Mishnah, they both are certainly arguing who has the calf. The Mishnah does not say it's a Shema. Each one claims for certainty that the calf was born in their possession. and therefore Sumchus is totally inapplicable. Let's get back to the first question. What happened to the Kamma? What happened to the presumption that upon knowing that something existed, we presume any change happened at the last possible moment? So the change of sale happened at the last possible moment after the animal had already given birth. 1 second. Okay. For Tani, you have to amend the Mishnah. The Mishnah is amended to say, the Mishnah is talking about Shema, uncertain claims. It's not, there's no certainty in the claims. Okay. Each one is making an uncertain argument, and that's why we go with Sumchus, and we prefer Sumchus over the presumption of the Kamma. Okay, the Mishnah continues, and it says, the next scenario of the Mishnah is where they're fighting over the big and the small slave or field. And they're both uncertain. They split it. In other words, both scenarios in the Mishnah are addressing a scenario of Shema v'Shema, uncertain claims. And it's in two different scenarios. The first one is when we have a question of when the animal gave birth. The second scenario is if he bought the large or the small slave field. So that makes sense. According to Rabbi Rafona, that Sumchus applies even in certain claims. If the Mishnah says that in the scenario of Bori, certain claims, that we prefer Yachlaiku, sure, the end of the Mishnah is also going to, where the cases, where the arguments are uncertain, for sure we're going to split it. For sure we're going to say Yachlaiku. Okay, so the Gemara says, this isn't a great proof. Why? Because Tana Seifa Legluya Reisha. 1 second. The reason why the second half of the Mishnah was Shema v'Shema was specifically to tell you that there's two scenarios. One is Shema v'Shema, one is Bari Bari. In other words, had the Mishnah only given one scenario where they're disagreeing with each other, I would think that scenario is Shema v'Shema, uncertain claims. But certain claims we would not apply Sumchus, like the opinion of Rava. That's why the Mishnah repeated itself. Two scenarios. One, this way I know that one is uncertain, one is certain, and in both scenarios, Sumchus says we prefer Yachlaiku. Yeah? Okay. Even then, you split the animal half and half. Okay. Tanan, we learned Zemer Gadol, Zemer Katan. One guy says I bought the large slave, and one guy says I bought the small slave. This is an example of Bari, right? They're both making certain claims. In the second half of the Mishnah, the guy buys either a field or a slave, and there's a large one and a small one. And the buyer says I bought the large one, and the seller says I bought the small one. Now, what's the halacha in the Mishnah? The seller makes an oath and pays the smaller field or the smaller slave. But 1 second, according to Sumchus, according to the opinion of Rabbi Rafona, that says that Bori, we apply Achlaiku, in a certain claim we apply split the baby. Why aren't we splitting the slaves? Why are we making oaths over here and the guy is exempt, the seller is exempt? Why don't we say Achlaiku? Because according to Rabbi Rafona, this is a scenario of Achlaiku. Because Sumchus is applicable even in certain claims. Okay. 1 second. So according to Rav, that says Sumchus is only applicable in uncertain claims. So this is not the scenario where they're contradicting each other has nothing to do with Sumchus. So it's not difficult. Why is the seller making an oath here and being exempt nobody should make an oath, and they should split it. Split the difference in the large and the small slave. So Gemara says, "Al Rabba Rav Huna de Amar in Amar Simchas Afilu Bari Bari." Amayish b'mayich. Yachal, give me by 1 second. So Gemara says, "Ma'id Simchas Heichad Ika Shvur Deraisa could be Inan Lamemer Lakaman." Simcha says this scenario is different because it's a requirement for a shvua da'araisa, a biblical shvua. What's the shvua? A shvua is bavametzia. Like we'll have to explain. Okay, so we'll explain the bavametzia part in a moment, but let's just explain Simchas. As we would say, Naniach will accept for now, and we'll discuss the details later, that the oath being made here is a shvua bavametzia, which is one of two types of biblical shvuas, 2.5 types. So it's the two types of biblical shvuas are shvua deraisa and shvuas bavametzia and shvuas hashomer. Admitting half and being a shomer, a watchman, and admitting that that something happened to the item. There's a third type of shvua deraisa, which is a shvuas eid echad. If a single witness testifies against you, you have to make an oath. Also shvua deraisa. Okay. Regardless, Simchas agrees that once you're obligated to make an oath because of bavametzia, so then you can't split it equally because you have to make the oath, and anyone makes an oath and is exempt from payment. Therefore, the seller makes an oath that he sold the small one and he's exempt from giving the big one. Good. Okay, just give me a second.
Wait.
So there were two slaves. One was a big slave, one was a small slave. Okay, so we have the contradiction, right? The seller says, I sold you the small one. The buyer says, I sold you the big one. So what happens is the seller makes an oath. Okay, so the Gemara says this cannot be bavametzia. Why can't it be bavametzia? For a few reasons. Amay yishba. Why is there an oath here? Masha ta'anu loy haydalay. Masha haydalay loy ta'anu. So we spoke about this yesterday, the day before that. The example of a classical bavametzia is Jules says to me that I owe him $100, and I say I pay you back 50. The other 50 I owe you. I have to make an oath, and then I pay. I make an oath and I pay 50. Now, what happens if Jules says I owe him wheat, and I say no, I owe you barley? It's not a bavametzia because we're admitting two separate things. So the Gemara says, 1 second, a small slave isn't a mini big slave. Right?
Part of a big slave.
Exactly. He's a different slave. So Masha Ta'anoi, that which the what do you call it? That which is being asked is not being admitted to, and that which is being admitted to wasn't asked for. Okay. And moreover, helachu. It's helach. So going back to the example. So Jules says I owe him 100. I say, no, I pay you back 50, and the other 50, here it is. That's called helach. Helach means that I'm paying you back immediately. So it's not called bavametzia because it's like a complete denial. It's basically I'm denying your claim. Because I'm giving you the $50 right now, it's like you're saying, well, you owe me another 50. And I say, no, I don't. So then there's no bavametzia anymore. So over here, the seller's like, I sold you the small slave, and here he is. Take him. It's yours. It's helach. There's no bavametzia. And moreover, the biggest problem here is that the general principle is you do not make an oath on property. And slaves are the equivalent of property. And by the way, the Mishnah had both examples, slaves and property. You don't make an oath on either one. So what's going on here? Okay, so the Gemara has a few different resolutions. Amar Rav says, what happened was they're not arguing over an actual field or an actual slave. They're arguing over money. How much money are they fighting about? The value of a large slave, the value of a small slave. Maybe there was an insurance policy, for example. they're fighting over, right? That would be a monetary claim in different amounts. That is a bavametzia. Also, it's not halach, right? Because we don't know. Well, maybe it is halach, maybe it isn't halach. Because they're arguing over money, not over a slave. So the seller says, well, I owe you a small slave. And who says he has the money to pay immediately? If he does, then he won't make an oath. And if he doesn't have the money, then he would make an oath. And there's no making an oath on property or slaves anymore because you're arguing over money, not over the actual property and slave. Okay. Shmuel said, they're fighting over the clothing of a large slave, the clothing of a small slave. If you have any questions about that, I'll just hold those questions. Okay. Or the bundles of a small field, or the harvest of a small field versus the harvest of a big field. That obviously is clearly an example of my bavametzia, right? So a large field has more bundles, more grain, and the small field has less grain. And you're admitting half, and he's demanding more than that. So versus clothing, right? So the guy says, I want the extra large shirt. And the seller says, well, I actually sold you the small size. It's a different shirt. So Gemara says, so I'll just explain the alfi in a second here as follows. Imagine, let's say it was a belt, right? So you go to the store, the large belt is a small belt plus a big piece, right? Because you can always cut it. So Yalfi basically is a clothes that are assembled from different parts that are connected, right? So you sort of connect the pieces and you turn it into a cloth. So it's possible to make a bavametzia here. The guy asks for a lot of pieces, and the seller admits some pieces. It's not like it's a fully made coat, in which case, obviously, a large coat and a small coat are different coats. But it's an assembly. It's a coat that's stitched together from different pieces, and each of the pieces is because there's more pieces in a larger coat and less pieces in a smaller coat, so it constitutes a shvuas bavametzia. Make sense?
No, but that's okay. No, I understand.
That's how you get the clothing of the clown.
What?
That's how you get the clown's coat.
No.
A little bit of this.
No, I mean, I understand what you're saying. It's just.
There is a version of Rashi in a different sector where Rashi actually says it's a belt. That would be the easiest to understand. A belt, clearly a large belt, a small belt is a cut large belt. It's the same. It's the same thing, right? And the bigger the guy is, then the bigger the bigger the belt will be.
But it's also like a watch strap with links.
Right. Exactly.
Oh, yeah,
Exactly. Exactly.
You put in more, put in less.
Right.
Exactly. For those on Zoom, Steve said like a watch link where you have those links, you take them off. Be a similar idea. That's what Yalfi is. So that's my bavametzia. The guy says more links, he admits less links. That's what it is. Okay, so where is it? Kashlele Rav Hoshia. Rav Hoshia had a question. Midek susktani. Are we specifically mentioning a piece of clothing? Evet ktani. So Rav Hoshia says the mission doesn't mention anything about clothing. It mentions something about a slave. So Rav Hoshia doesn't like this. He says, "Gan shetanu eved b'ksusay v'sada ba'imra." Okay, so according to Rav Hoshia, this is what we call Gilgul Shvua, the rolling of the Shvua. We roll everything on. So what happened? He asked for a clothed large slave. And again, the clothes here are like the belt, like the clothes that are put together from different pieces. And he admits a small slave with less pieces of the cloth of the coat. Now, because on the coat, there's a bavametzia, so then you could roll a Shvua onto the slave itself. Right. Similarly, he bought a field with bundles. He admits partial amount of bundles. That's a bavametzia. So now he can roll a shvua onto the field itself. So more says I'm probably the alfi. The clothing also has to be like we explained previously, but the alfi with the clothing that's sort of assembled from different sections. So more says kashle of sheshes. We had according to Rav Sheshes had a question. He said, according to Rav Hoshia, the mission is basically telling me this idea of Zaykin. meaning Gilgul Shvua. You could roll on the Shvua, but we already know you could roll on a Shvua. We had it many times. So Hatnina, Zaykin Achasim Shein Achrayas, and Achasim Sheyesh Lan Achrayas. Lishav Alen, where an oath could be made on property if it comes from a Gilgul Shvua. If it's rolled on from a legitimate Shvua. I mean, generally speaking, you can never initiate a Shvua on property. An oath on property. Because we don't make an oath on property. But if you're already triggered to make an oath because of a bavametzia or because of Shuas Hashemer or because of Shuas Echad, then you could roll the oath onto the property. Or as a rolling oath, you can make an oath on anything. El Omer of Sheshes says, Hamani Rameiri. Okay, so this is Rameir. Now, it's not just Rameir. We have to sort of assemble Rameir from different pieces. So we take different ideas and we blame them all on Rameir. And then we could fit Rameir in the mission. So let's start. So we've taken care of the last problem. He says that slaves actually are movable items. It's only taking care of half the last problem because the mission has two examples, a slave and property. So let's deal with the slave first. The property part we haven't answered yet. Okay. So now fine. So the slave is movable item, not property. You can make an oath on a slave. Fine. What happened to the fact that the thing with the wheat and the barley? If I ask you for wheat and you admit barley, it's not an admission. Gemara says, no. Like I said, we're packaging Rameir up here. So first we had Rameir the property. Now we add on Rabbi Gamliel. Rabbi Gamliel says, the Tanan Tano Chitim Haidus Aaron Potter. If he was asked for wheat and he admits barley, that's not a Maidah Mixus. However, Rabbi Gamliel says it is Maidah Mixus. Okay, fine, but we're still not done yet. Akati Helachu. This is an example of Helach, right? We said because the seller here is coming with his little slave and he's saying, here he is, go take him. So how do you get rid of Helach? So Amarava, Avda the Kotel Yoda V'Seller Shechavar Babar Sichan Amaris. Okay, we're talking about a scenario there's no Helach. Why? Because the slave lost his hand. So the small slave the seller promises doesn't have a hand anymore. Let's say it's an accident. Now, in this case, there's no halach because it's a different item. I never bought a slave without a hand, even according to the admission of the seller. So there's no halach. Or in the scenario of the field, where the field had holes dug in it. Halach is where the one who admits the claim pays it immediately.
Oh, right.
Yeah. So Gemara says, Rameir says the opposite. The Tanan we learned, goes al behema ve'eskino, avodim ve'eskino. A guy steals an animal and it became old. Or he takes slaves and they become old. Mishalem geshas exelo. 1 second. You pay like the time that they were stolen. Meaning you have to you pay for the fact that they got older in your possession. The thief pays for the fact that they aged in his domain. Okay. Rameir says, "But avodim by slaves, mishalim kashat segzelo." By slave, he returned. Sorry, Rameir by slaves, you can tell the guy, here it is in front of you. The fact that you don't have to pay for the fact that they aged. Why is this? This is because Rameir seems to be of the opinion that says that slaves are like property, and property can't be stolen, right? Because you know where the property is. You can't take it. It's fixed. So you can't steal the property. So therefore, when a slave returns the property, when a thief returns the property, he returns it as is. You can't really steal it. Similarly, you can't really steal a slave. And therefore, you don't pay for his aging. Meaning that even though technically a slave could actually be moved, but because a slave has the same rule of property, so therefore we consider a slave to be in the category that can't be stolen. If it can't be stolen, you don't have to pay for him aging, because he ages in the domain of the original owner, not of the thief. Now, this clearly indicates to us that according to the opinion of Rabbi Meir, a slave is like property, not like movable items, and therefore you should not be making an oath on a slave. So Gemara said, like a holy kash. This is not difficult. They actually switched the opinions. Rameir says you do have to pay for the aging of the slave, because Rameir holds it's a move, like the slave is immovable. I'd have the rabbi say it's like property, and therefore you don't pay. Okay. So the Gemara says, "Elamai discover Rameir makshin kalkala evid my ev nishbon af kalka nishbon dilma evid hu nishbon avla kalka loy." 1 second. Okay. So in other words, so we established that according to Rameir, a slave is like any other Ma'adim Mitzvahs. He's not like property. But now, like I pointed out before, that's only half an answer, because the Mishnah gives two scenarios. One scenario is a big and small slave, and the other scenario is big and small property. But if it's a property, in other words, so now we're left with the following question: does Rameir hold that you never make an oath on property, and a slave is distinct, or is it that Rameir says that actually, because we know you make an oath on a slave, you'll also make an oath on property? So that's the Gemara's question. I'll remind us of Rameir Mekshim and Kalkal Evan Ma'av Nishbon Av Kalka Nishbon. So okay, you make an oath on a slave. Do you mean to say that Rameir also says that now you make an oath on property too? Dilma Evid Hu Nishbon Avala Kalka Loy. Maybe Rameir says only a slave you make an oath on, but not on property. If you don't make an oath on property, we're back to square one, because the Mishnah's example is property. So Gemara says, that can't be. Tanya we learned. Okay, so this is a variation of the Mishnah. A guy switches a cow for a donkey, and the cow gave birth. Or somebody who sells a maidservant, and the maidservant gives birth. One guy says it happened in my domain, and the other guy is quiet. The guy who makes a certain claim, he gets to keep the infant or the calf. If neither of them know, then you split it. Okay, each one says that it happened in their domain. 1 second. Okay, each one gives a certain claim that the animal died in his domain. I'm sorry, gave birth in his domain. So okay, so now the seller makes an oath, just like in our Mishnah, because he makes an oath and he exempts himself. So he makes an oath that the animal gave birth in his domain, and he's exempt from handing over the calf or the fetus or the infant. It's the opinion of Rameir. You do not make an oath on slaves, and not on property. Okay, now the fact that Rameir's example includes a slave, Rameir's sovereign ishbon. 1 second. Meaning the fact that the rabbi, so Rameir says you make an oath on a slave. The rabbis say, no, you don't make an oath neither on a slave nor on property. The fact that they emphasize both the slave and property, even though the scenario is only a slave, clearly indicates to us that Rameir actually disagrees on both of them. He says you can make an oath not just on a slave, but also on property. The question was, maybe Rameir distinguishes between a slave and between property. On a slave, you do make an oath. On a property, you don't make an oath. And this brisa seems to imply that actually no, according to Rameir, both a slave and property could make an oath. Yeah. And we're going back to explaining how the Mishnah could fit with Rameir, because according to Rameir, both a slave and property, you could make an oath. Okay. One second. So Gemara says, "Mimai." Who says Dilma? Maybe Kishem Kamerle. Maybe the rabbis are trying to tell him, look, you admit to us that property you don't make an oath on. So why don't you admit as well that slaves are in the same category? Teda, I'll prove it to you. The time we learned from there are things that Rameir says that are like property, and the rabbis don't agree to it. You have 10 grapevines constitute a vineyard according to Rameir, but you would make an oath. And the rabbis say, no, you don't make an oath. Why? Because it's property. But listen closely. The debate here is when the grapevines are filled with grapes, where a mayor says because the grapevines are filled with grapes, therefore they're considered not connected to the property. So you could make an oath, and the rabbis say no, they're connected to the property. But what does that indicate to us? That if a mayor would agree that the grapes are not yet ripe, or you're dealing with grapevines without grapes, he would agree to the rabbis that property you do not make an oath on. So we're back to square one. Rameir, we cannot fit the mission with Rameir because Rameir only answers a slave. He would not answer the scenario of the property. And Rameir agrees that on property you don't make an oath. So what do we do? El Olam Kedur Rav Hoshia. We're going to the opinion of Rav Hoshia. Rav Hoshia says it's Gilgul Shvua, meaning because there's an admission over some movable item as well, be it the bundles of grain in the field, be it this type of assembly made clothing.
Mm-hmm.
That shvua is a shvua of bavametzia, and then you can add on the property shvua because of gilgul shvua. For the kash l'chas zaykin, it's strict. You need to tell me the concept of gilgul shvua. I already know gilgul shvua. Gemara says, I mean, I would think evet ke'eved dami omer tzaddik kesod dami ksus evet ke'eved dami omer tzaddik kesod dami kamashman. I would think there's no way to be. Look, the real fight here is not about the clothing, right? Obviously, we want to slay with clothing on it, not naked.
Yeah.
But the fight is not over the slave. The fight is over. I'm sorry, the fight is not over the clothing; it's over the slave. Similarly, maybe they're fighting over a few bundles in the field, but what's really going on here is he's selling property. So maybe we shouldn't look at the bundles or the clothing as significant at all. They're just a sideshow. The main show here is the slave and the property. And there shouldn't be a bavametzia on a sideshow, because that's not really what they're negotiating about. They're negotiating over the property and the slave. So since the slave and the property you can't make an oath on, we shouldn't make an oath on the bundles or the clothing either. And that's the chiddush of the Mishnah. That no, you could make a gilgul shvua even on something that's really tangential to the main transaction. That would be the clothing of the fighting over if the clothing of the slave was big or small. Mm-hmm. Or whether the bundles in the field were larger. Okay, have a great day.
So it's okay.
So therefore, you make a shvua bavametzia, and once you make a shvua bavametzia, you make a gilgul shvua on the rest of it. Have a great day and have a great chodesh.
Make it a great day.
Chodesh tov.